If you were dropped into the Pleistocene epoch tonight, you would probably stop thinking like a modern person within 10 minutes of the sun going down. The transition from day to night in the ancient world was not a time for rest. It was a biological emergency. As the light vanished, your eyes would rapidly fail. Human vision is an evolutionary marvel in the sunlight, capable of tracking movement across vast distances and distinguishing millions of colors to spot ripe fruit or distant water. But in the pitch black, the human eye is dangerously useless. Your pupils dilate, straining to pull in whatever ambient light exists. But the ancient night was an ocean of absolute, suffocating darkness. You would hear the snap of a branch. You would feel the sudden drop in temperature against your skin. You would smell the damp earth, but you would be entirely blind. This is where the ancient story of survival begins. It begins with the profound, terrifying realization that you are flesh and the dark is hungry. In the deepest chambers of Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, archaeologists have found something that changes our understanding of how humans survived this terror. Microscopic layers of ancient wood ash and burned bone have been preserved in the soil, dating back a staggering 1 million years. This is some of the earliest signature evidence of controlled fire, but look closely at what that evidence represents. It is not just a sign of ancient cooking or a gathering place for warmth. It is the physical residue of panic and defense. Among those ashes lies the memory of a single dying ember fading into white ash. That ember is the haunting object of our ancient past. It was the only thing standing between human flesh and extinction. Modern people are taught a very comfortable myth about the origin of fire. We imagine ancient humans sitting around a cozy campfire, roasting meat, and bonding as a tribe. We view fire as a tool of convenience that eventually allowed our ancestors to build civilizations. But that is a profound misunderstanding of the prehistoric world. Fire was not discovered for warmth. It was not adopted for cooking. Long before it was used to boil water or harden clay, fire was adopted as a defensive weapon against the dark. The human body lacked claws, thick hides, or the specialized sensory organs required to fight in zero visibility. But the predators waiting beyond the cave mouth were masters of the night. Their eyes possessed a reflective layer that multiplied moonlight, turning a pitch-black forest into a dimly lit hunting ground. They could smell human sweat and hear a racing heartbeat from incredible distances. For ancient humans, creating a perimeter of fire was not a luxury. It was an act of aggressive territorial control. The flame created a harsh, blinding border of light that nocturnal predators hesitated to cross. The fire pushed back the shadows. It gave the human eye a temporary sanctuary. But this technological leap came with a brutal psychological cost. Every member of the tribe knew that their survival was entirely dependent on a chemical reaction they barely understood and struggled to maintain. They had essentially tethered their lives to a fragile, hungry element that required constant feeding. If the wood was too wet, or the wind blew too hard, or the person on watch closed their eyes for just a moment too long, the defensive wall would collapse. Relying on this weapon changed human history forever. But it also meant that the most terrifying moment of the ancient night was not when the sun went down. It was the moment the ember began to fade. Modern people have an incredibly sanitized view of prehistoric fire. We imagine early humans sitting comfortably beneath a clear night sky, roasting meat over a cheerful blaze, perhaps sharing a quiet moment of tribal bonding. We think of the campfire as a place of comfort, relaxation, and warmth. But that is a modern luxury born of total environmental safety. For the ancient human, tending a fire was a high-stakes, nerve-wracking occupation. There was no relaxation. A fire in the Pleistocene was not a tame thing. It was erratic, hungry, and easily extinguished by a sudden downpour or a shift in the wind. To understand how desperate this relationship was, you have to look at where the fires were kept. When archaeologists excavate ancient sites, they do not just find the remains of a single, pleasant evening. They find massive, compacted layers of history. Deep inside caves, researchers have uncovered microscopic layers of wood, ash, and burned bone stacked upon each other, representing tens of thousands of years of continuous, obsessive fire maintenance. These layers are the physical residue of pure necessity. Ancient humans sought out deep recesses and rock overhangs because the open wind was too dangerous for their fragile flames. But lighting a fire inside a deep stone cavity creates an immediate, life-threatening problem. Caves do not have chimneys. There is no natural ventilation shaft pulling the exhaust safely into the sky. When ancient humans fed damp branches, dry brush, and greasy animal bones into the flames to keep them alive, the resulting smoke had nowhere to go. It pooled against the low stone ceilings and sank down into the living space. Picture the physical reality of that environment. Your eyes are constantly watering, burning from the thick gray haze that fills the enclosed space. Every breath you take coats your throat and lungs with toxic particulate matter. The air is heavy, suffocating, and sour with the smell of burning marrow, animal fat, and green wood. You are constantly coughing, your chest aching as carbon monoxide slowly builds up in the blood of everyone in the tribe, from the oldest hunters to the youngest infants. For modern people, this environment would be an unlivable nightmare. This was the brutal trade-off of ancient survival. They did not sit in the smoke because they lacked the intelligence to build better shelters. They sat in the choking haze because the alternative was immediate death. You could choose to sleep out in the open, breathing crisp, clean air under the stars, and be quietly slaughtered by a massive predator before midnight. Or you could retreat into a claustrophobic, oxygen-deprived stone chamber, poison your own lungs with smoke, and live to see the sunrise. Ancient humans chose the smoke. They chose to slowly damage their bodies because it was the only way to keep the teeth away. Yet, even inside the cave, bathed in that protective, toxic cloud, the psychological terror never fully faded. The fire was not a machine that could be switched on and left alone. It demanded constant attention. Staring into the hearth, a single dying ember fading into white ash was not just a signal to gather more wood. It was a terrifying countdown. The moment the heat began to drop and the light began to recede, the shadows crept further into the cave, inching closer to the huddled bodies of the tribe. They endured the suffocating air because they believed the blinding light made them safe. They chose the smoke over the dark. But the smoke could not protect them from what was pacing just beyond the light, testing the perimeter. To understand the paranoia of the prehistoric night, you have to understand the sheer scale of the things moving through the dark. Today, the largest land predators are mostly confined to specific regions, and human populations are safely insulated from them by concrete, steel, and distance. But during the Pleistocene, human beings shared their daily environment with a terrifying array of apex carnivores known as megafauna. These were not simply larger versions of modern animals. They were biological hunting machines, specifically adapted for an ice-covered, brutal world where calories were scarce and every meal required violence. Among the trees and rocky outcrops lived predators like the giant cave lion. It was substantially larger than any African lion alive today, possessing a dense, muscular frame that could drag an adult human away by the neck without breaking stride. There were saber-toothed cats with jaw structures designed to sever arteries in a single, devastating bite. There were massive, short-faced bears standing over 10 feet tall, capable of running down prey at incredible speeds. For these animals, the night was not a time of rest. It was their primary hunting shift. Their sensory organs were perfectly evolved for zero visibility. They could detect the scent of sweat, fear, and blood on the wind from miles away. Their padded paws allowed hundreds of pounds of muscle to move over dead leaves and loose stone in almost total silence. Modern people often assume that wild animals are naturally terrified of fire and will blindly run from it. That is a comforting thought, but it ignores the adaptability of a starving predator. Predators learn. Evidence from animal behavior suggests that while a sudden, flaring flame might startle a beast, a steady, burning campfire does something entirely different. It acts as a beacon. The smell of wood smoke and roasting bone marrow can travel for miles on the night wind. Over generations, the predators pacing the ancient landscape learned exactly what that smell meant. It meant that a group of soft, slow, poorly armored bipeds had gathered in one specific location. This introduces a terrifying new dimension to the brutal trade-off of ancient survival. When a human tribe sparked a fire in the mouth of a cave, they were creating a protective barrier of light, but they were also broadcasting their exact coordinates to every carnivore within a 10-mile radius. The fire was a shield, but it was also a dinner bell. Imagine the psychological torture of the night watch. You are sitting in the dirt, your eyes stinging from the suffocating smoke we discussed earlier. The fire illuminates a small, flickering semicircle of stone and dirt around you. But beyond that circle is a wall of absolute black. You cannot see the forest, you cannot see the valley, but you can hear the dry grass crushing under heavy paws. You can hear a deep, rhythmic exhaling just beyond the edge of the light. Sometimes, if the flame flares up perfectly, you might catch the sudden, twin reflections of eyes staring back at you from the darkness. The animals did not simply leave when they saw the fire. They stalked the perimeter. They circled the cave mouth. They probed the boundaries of the light, waiting with terrifying patience. They were waiting for the humans to make a mistake. They were waiting for the watchers to fall asleep. Most of all, they were waiting for the fuel to run low. They knew that as the flames dropped, the blinding barrier shrank, and the shadows stretched further into the cave. The fire was ultimately a psychological bluff. It only worked as long as it was bright, hot, and moving. If the humans failed to feed it, the bluff was called. The predators would step over the dying coals and enter the living space. We know that this was not just a theoretical fear. The fire kept the monsters at bay for as long as it burned, but archaeologists have dug deep into the soil and found physical evidence of exactly what happened when that fragile line of light was finally breached. Modern people use the word caveman as if deep stone shelters belong to us by right. We imagine early humans wandering through a harsh landscape, finding a quiet, empty cavern, and simply claiming it as a natural sanctuary. But nature does not leave premium, temperature-controlled, weather-proof real estate unoccupied. Long before a human ever set foot inside, these caves were already claimed. They were the established dens of apex predators, specifically leopards, giant hyenas, and massive cave bears. When ancient humans wanted to sleep in a cave, they did not just move in. They had to aggressively invade a dark, terrifying space, drive out the existing killers, and then hold that territory. The stone walls did not automatically make them safe. They were stepping into a contested predator den. We know exactly how brutal this contest for territory was because the Earth kept a physical record. In the cradle of humankind in South Africa, deep within the limestone chambers of Swartkrans Cave, researchers have unearthed a chilling sequence of fossils. Here, archaeologists have found some of the most famous early evidence of hominids using fire, dating back over 1 million years. But mixed in with those traces of ancient ash and charred bone is another, much darker narrative. They did not just find the tools of the human inhabitants. They found fossilized hominid skulls that tell us exactly what happened when the firelight failed to hold the line. One particular hominid skull found at Swartkrans bears a haunting signature of the ancient night. The bone features 2 distinct, perfectly spaced puncture wounds at the back of the cranium. Forensic analysis shows these are not the result of a rockfall or a primitive human weapon. They are the exact shape, depth, and distance of the canine teeth of a leopard. To understand what this means, you have to think about the physical mechanics of how a leopard hunts. It does not confront its prey in the open light. It drops from rock overhangs, or it strikes from the absolute blind spot of the pitch black. Its jaws clamp down on the back of the head or neck, instantly severing the spinal cord or crushing the skull, before it drags the limp body away into the dark to feed. The puncture wounds on the Swartkrans skull, found deep inside the cavern alongside the bones of giant carnivores, suggest a horrifying reality. The hominids here were not just living in the cave. They were being dragged deeper into it, and eaten by the very animals they were trying to hide from. The shadows in the back chambers did not just contain empty stone. They contained hyenas crushing bone and cats watching the human perimeter. The humans and the monsters were sharing the same architecture, separated only by a small, fragile circle of heat and light. This completely shatters our comforting image of prehistoric safety. If you were sitting by the fire at Swartkrans, you were occupying hostile territory. The original owners of the cave had not left. They were simply waiting for the soft, slow intruders to make a mistake. The fire was your only shield, and it demanded constant, exhausting payment in the form of dry wood and physical labor. If the flame wavered, if the wind blew the wrong way, or if someone on watch allowed that single dying ember to fade into white ash, the predators did not have to travel miles to find you. They were already inside the house. To survive in an environment where your shelter is actively trying to consume you, luck is not enough. You cannot survive by simply hiding in the dark, because the dark is where the predators are strongest. Every single night, the human group had to execute a flawless defensive strategy. They had to aggressively push back the shadows, knowing that a single moment of exhaustion meant death for the entire group. Holding that deadly territory against creatures perfectly adapted to the blackness required a behavior that went against every natural mammalian instinct. It required a desperate, agonizing leap in human psychology, one that would force the human body to change the way it operated and ultimately define our species. To keep a perimeter of light alive for 12 hours during a freezing Pleistocene night requires a staggering amount of fuel. Modern people who go camping often buy neatly chopped bundles of dry wood, easily throwing a few logs on a grate. Ancient humans had no steel axes. They had no metal saws. Every piece of wood had to be scavenged by human muscle. Imagine the physical toll of dragging hundreds of pounds of fallen branches, tearing dead bark with bare hands, or blunt stone tools, and hauling heavy, waterlogged timber back to the cave entrance. Their hands would have been perpetually calloused, splintered, and bleeding. Gathering firewood was not a quick chore done just before dinner. It was a massive, exhausting daily industrial operation that consumed hours of daylight and burned massive amounts of precious calories. They endured this agonizing labor because starting a new fire from scratch was incredibly difficult. Modern movies show ancient people easily rubbing two sticks together to create a roaring blaze in seconds. The reality is that generating a friction fire in a damp, freezing environment with numb fingers is a physically grueling task that often fails. Because sparking a new flame was so costly, ancient humans adapted a brilliant, desperate strategy. They simply refused to let the fire die. When a tribe moved across the harsh landscape, evidence suggests they transported live coals with them. They carefully wrapped a glowing core in thick, slow-burning shelf fungus or carried it inside large shells and hollow horns lined with damp earth. They carried the fire across the frozen valleys like a fragile, living organ. But carrying the heat during the day was easy compared to the brutal reality of guarding it at night. If that protected core was allowed to become a single dying ember fading into white ash while the tribe slept, the predators waiting outside would immediately sense the drop in temperature and light. The perimeter would collapse. To prevent this, humans had to invent a behavior that no other primate on Earth engages in. They had to consciously deny their own biological need to rest. They created the rotating night watch. Think about the psychological weight of that responsibility. You have spent the entire day walking, hunting, and dragging heavy wood. Your muscles are screaming for relief. Your brain is swimming with exhaustion, but it is your turn to sit by the hearth. You must stay awake in the suffocating smoke, staring into the oppressive blackness, listening to the sounds of massive carnivores moving through the dry brush. Your eyes burn, your head nods, and your body jerks awake in pure panic at the sound of a snapping twig. You know with absolute certainty that if your eyes close for 10 minutes, the fire will drop. If the fire drops, the cats will enter the cave. You hold the lives of your children, your siblings, and your elders entirely in your exhausted, trembling hands. This is where the ancient world stops being merely brutal and becomes deeply, profoundly human. Surviving the night watch required a level of absolute trust that did not exist anywhere else in the animal kingdom. You had to lie down in the dark and close your eyes, knowing the person on guard was just as exhausted as you were, but trusting they would fight their own biology to keep the monsters away. That shared burden forged the strongest social bonds in human history. But sitting awake in the dark for 12 hours a night, listening for snapping branches and feeding the flames, changed more than just their survival odds. Over hundreds of thousands of years, the discipline of the night watch, and the safety of the firelight physically rewired the human body. Look at a chimpanzee or a baboon preparing for the night. They do not sleep on the ground. They climb high into the canopy, building thick nests out of leaves and branches to put physical distance between themselves and nocturnal predators. For millions of years, our earliest ancestors likely did the exact same thing. Sleeping on the forest floor in a world ruled by giant felines and massive bears was a biological death sentence. But at some point in our evolutionary history, humans came down from the trees and laid their bodies on the dirt. We traded the physical safety of heavy branches for a fragile circle of heat. Evolutionary sleep science has revealed just how bizarre human sleep really is compared to the rest of the primate world. When researchers measure human brainwaves, they find that our sleep is highly compressed. We sleep for shorter overall durations than many of our primate cousins. But our REM sleep, the deep restorative phase, where the brain repairs itself and processes memory, is significantly longer and more intense. During REM sleep, the human body enters a state of near total muscle paralysis. You are entirely disconnected from your physical environment. You cannot hear a predator approaching. You cannot smell a shift in the wind. You cannot run. To enter that state of absolute paralyzing vulnerability on the floor of a cave, with nothing but a few feet of empty air between you and the open night, requires an evolutionary adaptation that borders on madness. Ancient humans could only achieve this vital, brain-expanding deep sleep because the fire acted as a surrogate tree. The blinding light was their new canopy. But a tree does not need to be fed, and a tree does not suddenly vanish. The fire was a temporary shield, and it required a conscious guardian. This terrifying necessity forged what might be the very first true social contract in the history of our species. We often think of human cooperation starting with organized hunting or the building of early shelters. But long before we coordinated to bring down a mammoth, we had to coordinate simply to close our eyes. Imagine the profound psychological weight of lying down in the damp earth, physically exhausted from a day of gathering wood, and letting your mind slip into total unconsciousness. You are surrounded by a pitch-black wilderness that actively wants to consume you. Your life depends entirely on the person sitting on the other side of the hearth. You have to believe, with absolute certainty, that they will fight their own crushing physical exhaustion. You have to believe that if they hear the heavy, rhythmic breathing of a giant hyena just beyond the light, they will not panic and abandon you in the dark. You have to trust that they will carefully monitor the wood supply, placing new fuel at the exact right moment, never allowing the core heat to drop to a single dying ember fading into white ash. That immense level of reliance physically rewired the human brain. It heavily selected for empathy, communication, and deep social bonding. The individuals who could not be trusted to guard the fire were likely banished or killed because a selfish watcher was a lethal threat to the entire group. The rotating night watch forced humans to become a tightly woven, interdependent unit. Your survival was no longer just about your own physical strength or speed, it was about the psychological reliability of your neighbor. This means the ancient terror of the dark did not just force us to harness a chemical reaction, it forced us to become a society. The fire gave us the safety to experience deep, paralyzing REM sleep, which in turn fueled the rapid expansion of the human brain. We became smarter, more adaptable, and more complex, because we finally had a safe place to dream. But sitting awake in the dark for 12 hours a night, watching the flames and listening to the breathing of the tribe also created something completely unexpected. When ancient humans established the rotating night watch, they accidentally created something entirely new in the history of the Earth. They created empty time. Think about the physical reality of sitting by a fire in a pitch-black cave for 12 hours. You cannot hunt. You cannot forage for roots. The light is too dim and flickering to chip delicate stone tools or sew thick hides without risking a severe hand injury. You are trapped in a tiny, illuminated bubble surrounded by lethal darkness, and your only physical job is to feed wood to the flames. You are terrified, exhausted, and wide awake. This enforced idleness was a completely alien state for a wild animal. Most creatures spend their waking hours either moving, eating, or scanning the horizon for danger. But the fire forced ancient humans to stop. It forced them to sit down in a tight circle and look directly at each other. During the daylight, human beings stand shoulder to shoulder, looking outward at the environment, tracking animals, and searching for resources. But at night, the darkness pushes everyone inward. The fire becomes the center of the universe, and the only thing to look at is the expressions, the fear, and the eyes of your tribe. This physical orientation acted as an evolutionary pressure cooker for human language. We know this by looking at anthropological studies of modern hunter-gatherer societies. Researchers studying these groups have recorded a fascinating shift in how human beings use language depending on the position of the sun. During the day, conversations are almost entirely practical. People talk about where the water is, who saw a specific animal track, or how to fix a broken spear. Daytime language is a mechanical tool used for physical survival and coordination. But the moment the sun goes down and the group gathers around the hearth, the language completely transforms. Nighttime conversations are rarely about practical work. They shift to the abstract, the unseen, and the imagined. They become about social friction, the memories of dead ancestors, the movement of the stars, and the unseen spirits waiting in the dark. Anthropologists believe this division of language is incredibly ancient. The brutal necessity of staying awake forced early humans to invent storytelling. When you are staring into the heavy shadows, listening to the guttural sounds of giant predators just beyond the light, your brain is desperate for stimulation to fight off sleep. You begin to weave the sounds of the dark into narratives. You talk about the animals not just as meat, but as monsters, rivals, and gods. You share memories of past hunts to teach the younger generation how to survive. You create complex social rules, building the invisible architecture of human culture simply because you need to keep the person next to you engaged and awake. All of human mythology, religion, and literature likely began as a desperate psychological mechanism to survive the night watch. Storytelling was not initially invented as entertainment. It was a survival technology. It was the only way to keep the brain alert when the exhausted body wanted to shut down. The terrifying responsibility of ensuring that a single dying ember did not fade into white ash gave us the time and the necessity to imagine worlds that did not exist. The fire kept the animals outside the cave, but it also cast massive flickering shadows against the stone walls. Those dancing shapes, viewed by exhausted, terrified, and highly social brains, became the first canvas for human imagination. We began to populate the darkness with our own stories. The ancient fire eventually went out, but the shadows it cast on the cave wall never left us. Think about what happens when the power goes out in your house late at night. One moment, you are surrounded by the hum of the refrigerator, the glow of your screens, and the absolute certainty of your safety. The next moment, there is a sudden, breathless silence. The lights die. The room plunges into pitch black. Notice what your body does in that exact second. Your breathing stops for a fraction of a moment. Your pupils blow wide open, frantically scraping the darkness for any source of light. Your heart rate spikes. Your ears strain against the quiet, listening for the slightest sound of movement in the house. Modern people often dismiss the fear of the dark as a childish phobia, something we are supposed to outgrow as we become adults. But that sudden jolt of anxiety you feel when the lights go out is not a weakness. It is a highly tuned, deeply embedded survival mechanism, functioning exactly as it was designed to. You are feeling the exact neurological reflex that kept your ancestors alive. Your brain does not know that you are inside a secure, temperature-controlled building made of glass and concrete. As far as your nervous system is concerned, the perimeter has just collapsed, the fire has died, and the monsters are stepping into the cave. We have spent the last 10,000 years building a world that tries to banish the ancient night. We paved over the dirt. We drove the megafauna into extinction. We wrapped the entire planet in copper wires and bathed our cities in an ocean of artificial daylight. We have conquered the darkness so thoroughly that we completely forgot why we were running from it in the first place. We look at ancient humans and think of them as primitive, pitying their harsh lives and their crude stone tools. We forget that they are the only reason we are here. They were the survival engineers who held the line. Every time you lock your doors at night, every time you feel a strange, primal comfort sitting around a backyard fire pit, and every time you instinctively turn on a light before walking into a dark room, you are proving that the ancient world never truly left us. We just covered it up. The human body is a living museum of prehistoric terror. Our biology was forged by thousands of generations of exhausted people sitting in the choking smoke, fighting their own heavy eyelids, and listening to the massive carnivores breathing just beyond the edge of the light. They sat there, night after night, century after century, passing the heat from one generation to the next. They traded the health of their lungs for the safety of their children. They stared into the hearth, carrying the psychological weight of the entire tribe, knowing that the line between human survival and human extinction was as fragile as a single dying ember fading into white ash. The modern world we built is nothing more than a larger, brighter perimeter. We are still just apes huddling together, trying to keep the dark away. You can surround yourself with all the modern comfort civilization can provide, but the ancient human is still inside you, waiting for the lights to go out. Before comfort, there was fire. Before safety, there was fear. And the night is still waiting.